Hello, dear friends, and welcome to another session of Searching for Answers. And we're delighted to be in the book of Ephesians, and it's slow moving because the book is so rich. We didn't get very far last time, but we hopefully said some things that were meaningful and encouraging. So I want to introduce the panel. So to my right,
Richard Rice, Loma Linda University.
And John Jones, the School of Religion at La Sierra University.
And Carla Gober at Loma Linda University.
And Ivan Blazin, Loma Linda University. Well, folks, we were in verses 3 through 5, commenting on a number of things there. But fornication and impurity of any kind or greed must not even be mentioned among you, as is proper among saints. And I think I'll stop the reading right there and see if we can talk a little bit and put a little bit meaning and substance to the word saints. What do we mean about saints? And can we indeed be saints? Are we saints? I'm just waiting for someone to...
Yes, we are, according to Paul. I think if we look at the...
There it is.
Thank you, Professor. I'll raise my hand and say... if we look at the Greek word, I think it's holy ones, correct? And if we sort of have a background of what holy meant fundamentally, it was to be separate from. What was holy was something that was set apart for a particular purpose. And if that's the case, then I think what Paul is saying is, remember that you have been set aside to play a particular role in the fulfillment of God's purposes. That's your identity. That's who you are. Now let's have the what you are come in line with who you are. Now that your identity is established, that's been taken care of by God. Now let's see how we can live the life that fulfills this promise and displays this identity in everything we do and for the world around us.
I don't think we ever find this word in the singular. We find it in the plural all the time. So it could be, you could say, God's people. I think that would be a fair translation of what Paul means.
Is that what you mean, Ivan? You use that word a lot.
Yes.
High saints.
Yeah, well, Alexander will say high saints. Yeah, well, this is how I think of it. People of God. And we're all joined together in the people of God. And how do you act toward other people? Well, how do you act as one who is a member of that? How do you act toward others who are members of the people of God? How should they be acting toward you? And so on. The word saints helps us with that. Yeah.
I don't know. That seems pretty ambitious to me.
Well, if you ask our students at Loma Linda University and some other Adventist universities, they find it very difficult to say they're saints. I'll say, how are the saints? And no one reacts too much. I asked that of a conference officer one time, coming into a conference office. I was coming through one door, and this officer is coming through the other door. And if you heard me say this before, just go like this and I'll stop. But I said, well, how are the saints? And he said to me, there's no one here but sinners making their way to the kingdom of God. And at that point, I knew that I was in trouble. And I said to him, well, surely, I said, if Paul could call the Corinthians with all of their problems saints, surely the august members of this conference could be called saints. And he looked at me with anger. And so I had to get out of there, you know. So I took my arm, my hand, and I put it upon his arm, and I said, look, the New Testament says that if you believe in Jesus, you're a saint. So you're a saint whether you believe it or not. And at that point, I just turned around and left before he hauled off and gave me a saintly nod.
Or displayed the identity that he had already claimed.
Yes, that's right. But that's a funny story, but it really gives evidence of the fact that it's very difficult. We think, I think we think in Catholic terms, frankly.
Well, that's right.
Yes.
That the word saint seems to connote the notion of a person who is radically set apart from others by their moral behavior or their spiritual attitudes or things like that.
Or maybe someone who's reached some perfected place. Yeah.
I mean, often it's a compliment to say, I have such regard for that person, she's a real saint. In other words, I see generosity, I see care for people, I see dedication to principle. So I don't think it's a pejorative term necessarily, but it's not one we're comfortable attaching to ourselves.
No.
Do you introduce yourself as a saint to your students? Do you say, "Good morning, I want you to know that I'm Saint Ivan"? Maybe not.
Now that I've never heard.
And I'm laughing because I'm finding this so wonderful. I think I'll try it and see what happens.
Remember, it's always in the plural, never singular.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that. But
Well,
go ahead, John. You're going to say something.
No,
come on. We
Well, I think, you know, there's so much about the New Testament that is aspirational, you know, that calls us higher, and we should take it seriously. It should be uplifting, it should be exciting, not in a cheap and shallow, fizzy way, but it should resonate of life, right? Paul says there are people who just have an atmosphere of life about them, and those are the saints. There are people who have an atmosphere of death about them, and that's another problem.
No, I think what you've just said and Ivan's story illustrates the attitude toward the Christian life, or the contrasting attitudes toward the Christian life that we see in a lot of people.
Yeah.
And one is that it's drudgery, and if you work hard enough, you have a chance of making it, but don't ever presume that that's a foregone conclusion. And the other is enthusiasm, exuberance, confidence that says, thank God for what He's done for us.
Yeah.
We know where we are, we know who we are, we know where we're going, and we can live a life out of confidence and enthusiasm in warmth toward other people that's affirmative
And depth.
affirming.
Because the
And
contrast here, as is about to come here, entirely out of place is obscene, silly, vulgar talk. So
superficial.
So along with life comes this considered life, this life of depth versus silliness and simplicity or
Right.
cheapness.
And I might just point this out. In 1 Corinthians, the first chapter and the second verse, here's what Paul says. To the church of God that is in Corinth, to those who are sanctified in Christ Jesus, called to be saints. Now, sometimes people mistake the to be, called to be. One day I shall be a saint, hopefully. But actually the to be, this is a question of to be or not to be, because the words to be are not even in the text. It just says called saints. And that means right now they are saints. They belong to God's people, to those whom Christ is transforming, to use your word, Rick, and so on. So we can be saints even now, but that does not mean we are perfect. And if you read 1 Corinthians, I don't see too many perfect people in 1 Corinthians.
No, yeah, that's for sure. Now, Ivan, that story you told us is pertinent because we do have a tendency, and I think we inherited this from the Puritans, that the Christian way, maybe going back to Pilgrim's Progress, is a way of long faces and trudging toward the kingdom, right? And it is possible, even as much as we turn aside from obscenity and vulgarity, for example, in verse 4, it is possible to misread the outcome of that.
Yes.
It's possible to read verse 4, out of place is these things, and they are out of place, no question about it. To wind up with a mental image of Grant Wood's American Gothic painting. Remember, stern, severe, hard people, man and woman, standing there. And the farmer's pitchfork, yeah, it looks like a satanic pitchfork or something. And that's not where this text is headed either. After all, instead, let there be thanksgiving.
Yes.
And that whole notion turns the corner at the end of verse 4, doesn't it?
Yes. And
sets up a totally different dynamic of affirmation, positive attitudes, joy and appreciation. Somehow, between the silliness and the overdone somberness, there is a pathway of light,
Love.
uplift, thanksgiving, May I use the word celebration? We need to ask ourselves that question, don't we?
Absolutely. Well, this is a very powerful, I mean, especially as it's being exposited here, a very powerful set of verses here. It's interesting that Paul will go back here in verse 4 to again say, let no fornicator, impure person, greedy person, and so on, let them not think they've got an inheritance in the kingdom of God. So it does make a difference how you live. I believe salvation is by grace, but I think it makes a difference. It's a transforming reality. And who would want to be different than Christ? I mean, we are different in so many ways, but yet we emulate him and so on.
But if you've got an arena where love is the abiding principle, it would be impossible to be there if one's operated out of greed. So rather than be exempted, it seems like more it's a foregone conclusion. There won't be any inheritance there unless if you're operating out of that principle, right?
Yes.
Of greed and idolatry.
Right.
So not so much a punishment as just as an outcome.
You don't fit.
You don't fit. And why would you want to be there if you don't fit?
I have a friend who made up a poem. I wish I had it right here now, but it was something like, once upon the courts of glory, when the time of inventory and inspection of the righteous rolled around, and he had the da-da-da-da-da-da. And so it tells about a fellow who goes up to heaven, and he's looking for a place to shoot craps. And he can't find any place. And he's really sad. So he decides to leave heaven. And the way the poem ends is, and little did he know that 2 eyes on him were kept, and Jesus wept. And so, you know, it's that love of Christ that calls us to be saints in the right sense of that term, and to realize that it's not ourselves, but Christ kind of coming in, infusing himself in us and in the community of his people.
Well, C.S. Lewis has, you know, an imaginative story in the book The Great Divorce about a busload of people that go from heaven, as he describes it, from hell on a day trip to heaven. And they've heard a lot about the place. They're interested. They're anxious to see what all the excitement is about. And instead of being happy up there, they can't wait to get on the bus and go back because they're so out of place there. You know, the attitudes, the values, the way people treat each other is so foreign to what they find themselves comfortable with that they just don't want to be there at all. So I think that makes the point that you were, or illustrates the point you were making.
We will end up where we're comfortable.
That's right. We will get what we want.
Exactly. We will get what we want. Yeah.
That sounds very nice, and it's also very frightening. Isn't that true? I think of Romans 1. 3 times in that chapter, like a bell, you know, tolling in the night, it says, God gave them up. God gave them up. God gave them up. And then some of my students will sometimes say, oh, that's terrible. God gave them up. But you got to, how do you say it? You know, and I try to illustrate if I can. You don't want me, so I give you you. And you'll find the satisfaction you want in yourself, but you don't get me.
Well, I think C.S. Lewis, I think it was C.S. Lewis, at least he's been quoted as saying something along these lines. To those who refuse to say to God, thy will be done, God ultimately says, then thy will be done.
Then thy will be done.
It.
Yes.
If that's what you really want, I'll respect your choice.
Yes.
My.
And that is what makes it frightening. If you think about what do I really ultimately most care about? Because that's what I may get.
My, oh my, I'm going to go home and pray all evening. Well, if you have nothing further to say up to verse 5, then why don't we start reading with verse 6, and maybe, John, you haven't read yet, have you?
Well, this is a considerable paragraph that follows. In fact, we could argue that it goes all the way down through 20. We're not going to do that. But I'll get us into a few verses here. This is that contrast that you mentioned earlier, Rick, of the contrast between light and dark. It is a dualism. But now it's not a dualism of flesh versus spirit. It is a dualism of light and dark, meaning empty words and disobedience on the one hand, and joy and obedience on the other. So here we go. Don't let anyone deceive you, my paraphrase. The NRSV says, let no one deceive you with empty words. For because of these things, the wrath of God comes on those who are disobedient. Therefore, do not be associated with them. For once you were in darkness, but now in the Lord you are light. So live as children of light. For the fruit of the light is found in all that's good and right and true. So try to find out what is pleasing to the Lord, parenthesis, and do that. 11, take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them, for it's shameful even to mention what people do secretly, but everything's exposed by the light that becomes visible. Everything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, sleeper, awake, rise from the dead, Christ will shine on you.
Yes,
That's an argument that's kind of eschatological, isn't it? That ultimately, what is light and what is dark will be made clear by the penetrating light of the divine presence that will reveal all things. So align yourself with that light and you have nothing to be concerned about.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's something to hear him say, for once you were not in darkness.
You were darkness.
But
You were darkness.
darkness.
And now you are light.
Yes, indeed.
I may have misread that.
No,
Well, it's once in a while when you drive along the freeways in California and see nothing but lights at night, you have to wonder what it would have been like before electric lighting illuminated everything. And you go back to the ancient world where night was really night. I mean, it was dark.
That's
and
right.
to have to travel at night would have been enormously perilous. And so the contrast that he's drawing would have been much starker in those days. When we think of night, we usually think of,
street lights and
street lights and headlights and neon lights and all of that sort of thing. But in the ancient world, the darkness would have been a very frightening thing, I imagine, or would have carried a lot of psychological significance. I mean, children often are afraid of the dark. They don't want to be left in a room where it's totally dark. They want light on somewhere, and we can think of how important that certainly it was and even is.
When my first wife died, we were at a lake. I was there with my kids and other family members. And all of a sudden I became aware of the fact that my daughter, Yvonne, my middle daughter, was gone from the place. And so I wondered, where is she? Everything is so dark out there, But she was so upset and hurting so much because of the loss of her mother. She craved the darkness. Really? She wanted to move. She felt like she was in darkness. And that's what was enveloping her at the time. And so she wandered around. We had a difficult time to find her. See? And she said, Daddy, I'm really glad that I have you. But she said, thinking of her mother, it's not enough, Daddy.
It's not enough.
It's not enough. And that was a powerful statement to me.
That's right.
My.
So there's all kinds of ways of being in darkness,
Right.
physical darkness, and kind of a relational, spiritual darkness. This question of what it means to become light, I'm going to tell a story that has not the depth that yours does. We have a Weimaraner, and when he runs in the light, he knows we can see him. So he'll stop and look back and see if we're watching and come back. But at night, he knows he can run off and we can't see him. So he knows this, and he uses the darkness to get, to run. Then we discover that if we have a flashlight and we shine the flashlight on him, his two eyeballs light up. He becomes light, but only his two eyeballs. And so we see those two eyeballs, and somehow he knows it, and he comes back. And I was thinking just just this morning, because we were hiking last night and this morning, what does it feel like to be in the darkness and to not be seen? There are these positive things about it, and that you can get and do and go. But then at some point it becomes scary and alone, and it's like you want to be found. Who would choose to stay there forever? You know, and then what does it mean to become light, which the text is talking about, that Jesus, we become light as Jesus shines on us. What changes in us? Is it a calling out of darkness, or does something change while we are yet in darkness? Like your daughter was. This question.
Well, of course, light's a powerful metaphor. We think of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, "You are the light of the world." I think I've heard that from a great distance, the human eye can spot a single source of light. Isn't it miles away?
10 miles.
10 miles, that's what I've heard. So it shows how important it is to us. And I've also heard from cognitive linguists that the distinction between light and darkness as a metaphor of understanding versus ignorance is virtually universal.
Around the world.
Universal,
In one culture after another, to say, "I see," or "the light dawns," as opposed to, "I'm still in the dark," is a kind of a way of talking about understanding something, knowing something.
Lack of clarity.
And how difficult it is to read that verse where Jesus says about the man who refused to give as he was given. He will be cast into outer darkness. I'm remembering that verse just inexact right now, but to be cast into outer darkness,
horrifying,
where there'll be gnashing of teeth and so on. That is frightening. But the darkness, that's the word that carries the day, to give that point across, get it across. Yeah. Okay. Well, how do we understand here the wrath of God? It's because, let no one deceive you with empty words, because of these things, kind of things he's been describing, that the wrath of God comes on those who are disobedient.
There's been a good deal of scholarly ink spilled over this verse, and particularly trying to figure out who are the people who are deceiving these members with empty words. We don't know. We simply don't know. But it may be that it is bound up with some kind of a dualism again, that whole thing about you can do certain things that don't affect your spiritual being at all. And this is a corrective to that. Don't let people lead you astray, literally, with this wrong advice, these empty words, because it's dangerous. Try rather, verse 10, to find out what really is pleasing to the Lord. There's a contrast between verses 6 and 10, I think, and live that way.
Well, that business of finding out what is pleasing to the Lord, a little bit later in the chapter, in verse 17, understand what the will of the Lord is. And we're called to understanding, and why live without it? We can have that understanding.
Try to find out, learn, understand these verbs of apprehension, of comprehension, of getting it, are repeated here, and that's not a small thing. This is going somewhere.
I learned something once in a class in college years ago when I was teaching, and I said to the class, I said, we don't always know. It's not written out in commandments and on paper always what our duties really are. We have to find out what they are and so on. And one girl, very upset, said, look, I can't do that. I have to know what God wants me to do. And she was filled with fear over the idea of finding out what the will of the Lord is and understanding it and so on. Yet that's
She was afraid to find it, or she wanted it spelled out?
She wanted it spelled out.
Okay. I've heard of people who, somebody was visiting people, say, sort of door to door or something like that, and asked a woman if she'd like to know more about the Bible, and her response was no. we're going to be judged on the light we have, and I'm having a hard time living up to the light I already have. I don't need any more.
Well, that's a difficult thing to watch, is that people who are in darkness about something and don't want to know. I talked with people who each knew that the other one didn't love them, but did not want to talk about it with the other.
Oh, really?
And so it's like this darkness is a comfortable place. I'm interested here where the text says, sleep or awake, rise from the dead. So we're in verse 14. So so we have this interesting convergence of something covered, being asleep, being dead. It's like, wake up, make it clear, live in the open, expose the darkness. It's this wonderful place of awareness, I think the text is trying to bring us to.
Everything that becomes visible is light. Just a little bit ago, he said, you are darkness. Now he says, you can be light. Not just in the light, but you can be light.
Can be light.
Yeah, that is a powerful statement. Well, Carla, you want to summarize for us, or could you summarize for us something that has emerged out of this?
Well, I think this contrast of lightness and darkness, light and dark, is really interesting to me. I did some research that discovered this whole idea of being able to see. And it's this place of peace to be able to expose what is true. And I think the text is really zeroing in on that.
All right. Well, I think we've come to the end of this particular session. And so we just say blessings on all of you who have heard. And we'll see you next time.